What the way this is going to work is I'm going to go through maybe 8 or 9 minutes here of just, sort of giving you a little bit of what we're seeing here. I had the pleasure of working with the Typeface crew on a white paper that we're going to be releasing here and that is going to be available to all of you about the idea of what's going on here with AI first workflows is what we'll spend a lot of time talking about today. And so the idea here is that I just want to tee this up sort of to level set here. And then I'm going to bring Arushi in and we'll end up having a bit of conversation about actually what's really going on here from that perspective. And so let's talk specifically. Like I want to walk you through this shift. It's quietly, but very quickly changing how marketing teams are beginning to operate. And I mean that literally. It's not just what kind of content is getting produced, what kind of campaigns are getting produced. We have talked ad nauseum about that kind of thing, but this is really how we're starting to work with AI, how we're going to explore a new kind of intelligence, one that just doesn't help us with the content itself, but actually helps us run the system of marketing. And so that's it, right? So the idea here is that Gen AI's promise, and there was kind of a messy reality to all of this as we started to really, get into this, right? So it's what we've been experiencing over the last couple of years. I mean, no doubt we've seen an explosion in generative AI, and it's been exciting, daunting, fear-mongering, all the sort of emotions have run wild here. But tools could generate headlines, blog posts, ad copy, images, video. We're seeing improvements to that every single month, it feels like. And we've seen productivity spike. We've seen some interesting things on the backside of that. We got faster. But what we started to notice is that we could produce content more quickly, but workflows, the way the decisions were made, the way that assets are managed, the way that campaigns are adjusted, that content strategy that we have been thinking so long and hard about for the last decade, it wasn't getting any smarter. And in some cases, they were getting a lot messier, right? The tools were fragmented, the workflows were inconsistent, content is being produced faster, yes, sure, but not necessarily in a better way and not necessarily more strategically. So now there's an interesting development happening. And it's this idea that we think around agentic AI. So this is where we learn about this new concept. And certainly there's a lot of hype around this, but there's also a lot of reality which is actually taking place. Because unlike generative AI, which basically sits around and it waits to be told what to do, and then it outputs some content or some insight for you, hopefully, agentic AI takes initiative, right? It observes, it learns, and then it actually takes action. So you can imagine a bit of the difference like this. So if generative AI is that helpful intern sort of, partner who types fast and you give them a specific task, well, agentic AI is more like that team member who sees what's happening across your systems, identifies that gap, and then takes steps to address it. Maybe, and sometimes even before you've noticed that there was a gap even there. Quick example, right? A generative AI tool might draft an email when you ask it to, but an agentic system, an AI first workflow kind of system might notice that a really strong white paper that you published 6 months ago sitting in your digital asset management system, it hasn't been used, it hasn't been surfaced, so it's buried in your CMS and it surfaces that asset. And maybe it updates the metadata to make it a little more findable and suggest for an upcoming campaign. All of that didn't require a prompt, it just started taking action based on rules and or things that agent would comply with. And so this is no longer the idea that, we're trying to look out into the future and sort of see what this is. This is already starting to happen. Gartner, by the way, just recently named agentic AI one of the top 25 this year, top 25, I should say, strategic technology trends. They're predicting that within the next couple of years here, 15% of the work decisions will be made autonomously by AI agents. And that's up from virtually zero today. Like it's not happening that much at all today. But the question for us then becomes a really pronounced one. Like it becomes really like, where do we start focusing? How do we start making this real? Because if you start thinking about it too much, you get overwhelmed with the amount of stuff that could be happening and the idea of where it could be happening. So where do we actually focus? Well, one thing that we've really started to see is that there's a really interesting angle to pursue here with this idea of AI first workflows. Workflows is stuff let's be honest, none of us really love working on that stuff. We don't really enjoy trying to figure out workflows. Let me, get a meeting together for the best workflows, said nobody ever. But the idea here is that AI first workflows can be really, really helpful. Workflows have historically been siloed. The tools are scattered, the teams are disconnected. I mean, I work with clients all the time to sort this problem out, and it often feels like we're managing a system that nobody really designed, that just sort of grew up all the way around us. But if we start thinking about how we might employ an agentic AI tool to give us a new kind of intelligence, to connect the dots that we didn't even know were there necessarily, well, now we can start to turn that mess into something that's actually learnable, iterative, intelligent, able to scale, all the things that we really want with workflow. And so here's the thing. The good news is you don't need the perfect system in order to do that. In other words, one of the things that we've been discovering as we've done all this research is you don't have to have the perfect process map in place, the pristine documentation, the perfect, complete enterprise-wide data to get moving here and to drive value. That can be overwhelming as well. And in fact, what we're finding is that these rigid systems that were often there, if there were any there, can sometimes even block agentic AI from being effective. And what's better, we're finding, is that it's defined for sure. Everybody understands that it's defined, but it's a flexible environment and one that's built to be improved upon. So for example, if we think about 2023 for a minute, as the year Gen AI sort of exploded and we all started experimenting with this stuff, 2024, last year, was really the let's call it strategy realignment and trying to figure out how to actually integrate this stuff. Then hopefully 2025 becomes the year of integrating workflows as a really key piece of how we make this AI thing real and valuable to our business. And so that gets into, well, okay, what does that look like? What does building smarter AI first workflows really look like? And we're going to get much more into that as Arushi and I start talking. But just to sort of think about this for a second, like, what do you need to know? What does it actually mean to start building one here, right? So the key is that we're not talking about automation in the traditional sense, right? Isolated, repeatable tasks that are just, rinse, repeat, rinse, repeat, rinse, repeat. We're talking about a system that has intent, a network, for example, of agents that may be working toward a shared goal across teams, across timelines, across different technologies. And there are sort of 5 kinds of practices that we've started to see that can help make, I should say, this shift real in your business. And so the first one is this idea of specialized agents, deploying things for different jobs. Instead of thinking of one do-it-all bot, right? Think of it as a digital ensemble, content agents that are generating creative assets, performance agents that are monitoring, results in real time, workflow agents that are managing, tasks and approvals. So IBM actually calls this the digital symphony, if you will, and companies that are doing this, as they report anyway, are seeing a 45% reduction in campaign production timelines. But then when we start thinking about other ways to do it, well, then there's things like content reuse. If you've heard me talk at all over the last decade about the importance of getting content reuse. And so using AI and agents to really dynamically surface and reuse things like brand assets. So for example, many of the organizations that we work with, they're sitting on a mountain of content that's underused, right? We've all heard those statistics, that sales only uses 25% of what we have. We can't find anything. We can't get this. So now we can start using agents to maybe do better tagging, to do semantic search, to do behavioral cues. Agents can surface that right asset just at the right moment, not just basically what's most recent, but rather what's most relevant to a particular situation or a time. Now your content library becomes a more renewable resource, not just a graveyard of dead sort of content. And then lastly, when we start thinking about this, is the idea of when we start looking at a few things put together, right? So one is training agents on your world, right? Off the shelf, those are fine. You're going to find those everywhere. But the real value, when we start teaching these agents our language, our industry, our rules, customizing it. So legal review for healthcare, SKU precision in your retail business, those nuances, they matter to you. And so they will matter very much to the AI and the agents that you might put into place. That's it, basically what transforms it from being sort of just a clever assistant who can write some copy to being sort of a more strategic idea. But also the idea, and we've heard this promise, right, forever, which is we can start to offload the idea of that low value work, right? Again, I come back to the idea that workflow, things like tagging, meta tagging, all these kinds of things, reporting, these are the kinds of things that none of us really want to focus on. We all have to do it. We do it. And sometimes we don't do it, if we're honest. But these are the kinds of things that can distract us from the work that we really want to put up on the screen, where we really want to put better experiences in front of customers. So we can use the Agentic AI to be able to clear that clutter, to free us up to that high value work. And then last but certainly not least is we can start designing around the AI, right? Designing our workflows with the AI in mind. And this is really the heart of the idea of the AI first workflow mindset. So we're rethinking the implementation, not just retrofitting an old workflow into an agentic one, but rather rethinking, what if we designed our roles, our responsibilities, the handoffs of the people around this sort of hybrid human AI team, where we reassign things based on that. And honestly, our discovery there and the research that we did was really, this is going to require a cultural shift more than anything else. It means treating the agents as collaborators for certain, but it also means not losing the human element of it, right? The people matter here, building the feedback loops in the people so that they learn and that the AI agents learn as a result of that. So the idea here is not just replacing people. That's the key here. You've heard me rant on that for months and months and months now. We are getting smarter, not faster, right? So when you start to think about this evolution, like, what are we doing here? This AI first workflows, they're really happening. Right? They're quietly transforming how content is being managed, measured, and moved. The teams that are getting the most of these aren't the ones, that basically are sort of replacing people and they're all sort of trying to get more content out the door, et cetera. No, they're the ones that have the clearest vision for how content moves through their business, who creates it, how it's used, how that changes over time. So it's not just about working faster, although that will be a benefit, but it's about working smarter, more coherently, more creatively, and dare I say, maybe even with more joy for the people that are actually doing it. All right. So hopefully that levels us up. And so we're sort of working from a common foundation here as we start to think about it, right? And we get to, let's bring this into a conversation, because I have had the pleasure of working with the Typeface team and on this kind of stuff for a bit now. And what I'd like to do is just introduce Arushi Jain, who is the Senior Director and Head of Product Marketing at Typeface. And Arushi, I would love to just have a chat about what we're really seeing out there in the world of this AI first workflow. So maybe let's just jump right into this thing. So in the scheme of time here, first of all, welcome, and tell me what you think about what you've just heard here. How is this going to reshape our marketing teams in the near future?
First of all, thank you, Robert, and really excited to talk to you all today. This is obviously a topic that's very passionate to me, and not only from the work what we do, but I think for marketers, we're facing this problem every single day on how we'll use AI. So love to hear from folks after the call too on just if anything resonated or what is top of mind for you. So if I think about agentic AI and what we've been talking about with our customers and what I've been hearing from various marketing leaders, I think the biggest thing that as you're developing innovation, and then Robert, you touched on this, is what's the shift between what we call traditional automation, I would say task-based automation with software and SaaS, now moving to agents, where you're really moving from software as a tool to software as a system, where agents can actually learn and adapt. So it's back in the day when we did SaaS and all our software that we're trained on, it automates tasks for us and makes our lives easier and more efficient. You can format my emails, you can automate my lead routing, you can create a sequence for me, but a lot of it's still project management and it's more automation based. With agentic AI, what we're seeing is it's really going to understand what is your intent, what is your workflow, and adapt and learn from you. So you're flipping that script from actually just automating tasks to really acting on your behalf. So what I think with marketing teams, a lot of the discussion that we're seeing is we're moving away from this very siloed approach to marketing. Like today we structure our teams around functions and roles, and then you're performing a project and you're delivering it. The future, I see that being a lot more of these like cross-functional tiger teams where you're going to bring together all sort of functions. You're going to play roles that stretch across functions, whether it's creative, ops, brand, etc. And they're going to come together to really talk about how to deliver initiative instead of just a task. And that means that marketers themselves will be less just the day-to-day executors, but more like creative directors of that project and that vision, and collaborating and guiding that agents to help handle like the day-to-day task execution. But you're really driving that strategy and the vision and making sure the workflow adapts to how you work and your initiative.
I think that's such an important point, and I would love for you to put a bold and an underline under this, because so much of what we see from like the universe of tools out there is there's a lot of noise around this idea of agentic AI, but when you sort of peel back the layer, that one layer, it is just automation, right? It's just, it's classic marketing automation. Trigger, if this, then this, if this, then this, and you build those sort of rules and triggers. And what you're talking about in this sort of cross-functional tiger team idea and automation but not automation in the classic sense, is something very different, like you just talked about. Let's press on that one layer deeper and just tell me so when you're looking at that sort of idea of reshaping the marketing team, how does it differ from the classic marketing automation with trigger-based this, then, you know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. I think like if you think about let's take like a nurture flow sequence today. What do you do with traditional automation? I think what we do today is you hardcore all the steps, like a form. Somebody fills out a form on your site, it triggers an email. 3 days later, you probably send out your nurture sequence that you crafted each of these emails by hand, et cetera, et cetera. Gen AI came about and it already changed that workflow dramatically, where now all those sequences, all that content in that sequence could have been, for instance, generated by, prompting it, create me a content, make it more personalized, change the tone, make it on my tone. What you're really going to do with agents now is you're still not going to have to ask for it. They're going to see content coming in. They're going to automatically adapt it because they're going to understand your brand or understand your data or understand your goal or your audience, actually route it to the right reviewer because they know your workflow and your steps. And then once approved, send it back to that system to publish into your sequence. So it's that end-to-end flow that's really going to become a lot more like automated without you telling it what to do. So it's like beyond automation. It's really like learning and adapting like on its own. So I think automation is really like traditional automation was like steps, like, and follows rules. Gen AI follow prompts. Agents is really following intent. So that if you think about that sequence, that will change marketing, because the more it can understand your intent, the more it can help you kind of achieve your goals or more business initiatives. Instead of just, can you write this email? It's going to take like, how do I make this nurture campaign adapted to like the 3 different audiences I want to do? How do I take it from the intent signals I had and make it a lot more personalized? And then how do I make my workflow so my time to market to launch that campaign is now in days instead of weeks?
I love that. I love that. There's a whole vein of content to start an education around this idea of, instead of following rules, it follows intent. I mean, I love that. That's a great line, right? I mean, it's just that's a great way to distinguish it, right? Where it is not about just, isolely following rules no matter what happens, but it's actually looking at the intent of the person, whether that's a time-based thing. In other words, I need it right away, because I understand the intent, or it can wait 2 or 3 days before the follow-up, or there's a specific piece of content that actually is more relevant, or, it's actually understanding the intent behind it to be able to, yes, ultimately get to a common goal, which means but it's how it gets to that common goal can be really personal and based on what that individual user is looking for in that particular example. Am I getting that right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Well, fantastic. Well, let's take a look at our next topic here and just keep us moving along here, which is, okay, so when we start to think about these AI first workflows, right? So we're classically trained, when we start to think about workflows, and the idea there is, okay, it is sort of the if-then rules, and we sort of map it all out and all those kinds of things. how do we start retraining our brains to think about AI first workflows differently? Like, how do we start, from the architecture forward, right? So it's great to be able to talk about the result to say, okay, it's intent, not rule-based and all that. But help me understand how we start to retrain our brains to say, this is how workflow starts to look different when we're starting to architect it, when we have this AI first idea.
Yeah, when you think about AI first, it's like a term now everybody's using, right? So it feels like jargon. What is
Sure.
AI? What is AI first? But when we actually talk about AI first workflows, I think what it means is most teams today treat AI as a feature, or a lot of products that are already built are like kind of bolting on AI. So we think about like, okay, can we use AI to draft an email or draft a social post? Can I use AI to like summarize my meeting notes for me and come up with action items? Those are all great. But when you're thinking of really AI first workflows, you're going to have AI embedded into every start of the process. And it almost starts with AI driving the flow instead of it just being like a step function help at each step of the workflow. So I think about when CRMs came out, it took like your manual way of documenting all your leads and all your notes, and they made it all centralized so that sales could be like a lot more repeatable and a lot more automated. Now, Agentic AI is going to do that for, I think, marketing, or honestly all of work in that on steroids, right? Because it's now going to lead that workflow and understand from the start of it, like we said, the intent and the objective. It's going to constantly be learning. So even when you're not asking it or prompting it, it's going to give you recommendations, or it's going to anticipate. So that way you're now getting this kind of supercharged workflow across every step of your process. And AI is really deeply embedded throughout instead of it just being like a feature that you use. So I think the idea of agents, when it comes there, like agents is just making this where you now have something you can train and really be like your assistant throughout that workflow. So we're seeing like there's going to be a lot of agentic workflows where we're going to take a lot of traditional workflows, learn it, and they're already going to have that completely mapped out for you, whether it's for content, whether it's for data collection, et cetera. And that's why we're seeing like a lot of people building custom agents. Like one of our customers just built a custom agent where they needed to launch a push notification campaign in just 3 days. And they had a spreadsheet with over 4,000 product names, I think, with like all these different specifications, and manually preparing that content would take in days. So using creating custom agents, they could do that in minutes because they had this agent automatically generate, here's the type of push notifications I want, this is the format I want, this is the messaging, now match it to all the names. So things like that, that's an AI first workflow.
That's a really interesting way to think about it. So at the most practical level, and make sure I'm getting this right, it's sort of thinking through like a matrix of options, right? Like a matrix of saying, here's the messaging for this, here's the content for that, here's the different ICPs or personas, or is it sort of them formatting sort of and thinking about a matrix that says, here's what you can use as sort of a resource to put A plus B plus C, or C plus B plus A, or D, all of that together, which, to your point, would take months if a person was doing it. But if you've got an AI agent doing it, looking at that sort of, here's the, all the different combinations of the, 10 by 10 by 10 by 10, sort of different ways of appropriating things. And it would be, thousands of combinations. That it starts to, that's the sort of idea of the new workflow, is it's coming up with this matrix to sort of instruct it on the common goal, and here are your options for getting there. Is that the right way to think about it?
Yeah, I think the way to think about it is context. Basically, the key word here is going to be you have to provide the system and the agents context, and they're going to use that context to automate all the other spots of the workflow. And I think a lot of it is going to be also choosing platforms that are creating these workflows out of the box. So what I mean by that is, if a lot of times right now, if you're just prompting ChatGPT by one by one, it's incredibly effective. It's one of those things where you'll get amazing outputs, amazing results, but you're not building repeat intelligent, you're not building a workflow. Right. So how do you build custom workflows, or how do you build that with platforms that are offering this, where they're taking what is the steps, what is all the kind of decisions you need to make and actions you need to make, and combine that with the context you provide, combine that with the intel into the system that you provided, and then create kind of the steps of the workflow that you can use in a much more dynamic fashion instead of doing this one by one.
I love that. I love that. And it's a great segue. It's a great segue to our next topic, which is thinking about, okay, what do I need to do to start this, right? So when you look out at all of the clients that you work with, what are you seeing as some of the, like literally the smart first moves? Like what is the way that we can start to think about taking that first step? Is it designing the workflows, or is it figuring out our data? What are some of those first smart moves that we can start taking to actually make this a reality?
I love this question because it's something that I feel is so real to me and to like so many of my peers and our customers. Because I mean, being honest, like every time I talk to even just like one of my friends or like a peer or a CMO that we're engaging with, there's so much FOMO and there's so much like fear around AI, because it's like the biggest question we're all like feeling is like the quiet panic. Are we behind the curve? Like, are we starting too late? Are we not doing enough? And it's like the number one thing I hear behind closed doors, like, is like, okay, I have a lot of pressure to do with AI, but how do I do it? And it's like 2 years in. So the truth is, though, only a handful of companies are doing really well with AI. I think most people are still in experimentation phase and are really, no one has a full blueprint quite yet. So when I say like, how do you start small with it, is a lot of times people are like, let's do these big initiatives. I mean, don't aim for a moonshot. Honestly, start small. Like we always say with our customers, like, let's start small with a real use case, prove out value. And then if you can find like a real win, that win story drives so much mileage across the org. It builds a lot of like camaraderie among stakeholders and gets a lot of buy-in too, to like scale it across the org. So it's like, let's prove out value. Let's make sure you nail that use case. And then that makes it easier to scale and operationalize. And honestly, don't let perfection stall progress. So many times it's like we want this perfect bullet, or I see marketers or other teams get in this cycle of just trying to get one perfect asset, like 5 out of 5. How many things are
Right.
5 out of 5? Like we don't need everything to be a 5 out of 5, actually. Like how can we do more or try new things or experiment more? So like being able to play with it, and like it's okay. Like I think Robert, you mentioned this, is like you don't need perfectly clean data like to start, like you don't need everything to be this like ideal environment. Like start with the messiness and kind of iterate and refine from there. Yeah, Robert, like from that, I think you were speaking a lot on this, like from what you're seeing, like what have you seen as like the top small moves you recommend, or like the biggest surprises from marketers?
It's exactly like what you just said. One of the things that we see so often is that we get into hand wringing, right, around the idea of, I spoke a little bit about this in the introduction, which is it all feels so overwhelming, right? I mean, and by the way, this is content strategy writ large, which can, you get into this sort of like, well, there's this, and then there's that, and then there's this, and then we can do that, and we can do this, and we can, and then, but if we're going to do this and that and this and that, then we're going to have to clean this database, and we're going to have to clean our CRM system, and basically our content database and our digital asset management system is all messed up, and all of a sudden, the whiteboard is filled with problems that we have to solve before we can take the first step. And it's like, instead, the sort of idea is that you can start, maybe it is literally just the, an email nurturing thing, right? Where you don't need to boil the ocean in order to start this process. And, the tools, including the, not, big, big softball here, including the one we're talking about here today that's sponsoring this webinar, but can allow you to do that in a componentized way. In other words, you don't have to sink your teeth into solving every problem for the enterprise before you start getting some value out of this thing. And so whether that's limiting the data that you're going to look at, limiting the content you're going to look at, limiting the workflow steps you're going to look at, limiting the function you're going to work at, it's the same advice that we give in solving content strategy, which is don't try and solve the entire enterprise's problem from the get-go, right? Solve one part first and then let it grow, and then let it grow and let it grow. We're not in a hurry here. We can actually do this slowly and intelligently and wonderfully, and keep it all, and keep it all in scope.
No, definitely.
Yeah. Well, speaking of that, so quickly, let's talk about, okay, so yes, this is where I see teams getting stuck, right? And so, okay, but yes, no, now we have, so they so Arushi, they listen to our advice, right? And they start small. And now all of a sudden they start wanting to take that next step. Where do you see teams sort of getting stuck, right? Like, where are they getting stuck? Even if they start smooth and they start smart, where are they getting stuck in the initial in the initial engagement there?
I think a lot of times teams get stuck because AI doesn't work exactly how they expected, or it's not mimicking their workflow, or they're expecting it to like magically fix everything. I think AI is amazing, but it's not a magic fix like right now. Or if you're just trying to do your exact same workflow and not change your workflow AI, then you're also getting stuck. So a lot of it is, as cliche as it sounds, it's honestly mindset first. And then I always say it's like how then you bring on the workflow and agents. So a lot of time with where you can use AI, there's so many, like if you map out, we actually sit with our teams and just map out their day-to-day and map out their entire workflow, what they're doing now, and seeing like what is the 80% time sucks. And it's interesting because a lot of times if you map out your day-to-day, it's not what is in their job description. And a lot of leaders are shocked on like what their team is spending most of their time doing. Like you can spend so much time, like when one of our customers saying this is just honestly their biggest challenge was using their content libraries, plug it in and just finding assets in there because you had to like label every metadata, like label, it didn't even work. They could never find an asset from a campaign and they're like a global brand. So they have hundreds of assets. So like that is such an easy use case for AI to automate that. And then you could drive more value of using it in a campaign. So it's like, can you map out your real day, find that 80% time suck, and then as cliche as this is too, sometimes it's like you have to identify your force. It's all about people and processes. Like who's your force multipliers? One of the things I read in BCG was like 70% of AI tools fail, not because of tech, or projects fail, but not because of tech, but because of people and processes. So we always talk about this with our team, and it is a lot of change management, and it's like the number one thing stalling AI projects. So like who is that cross-functional team? Like who are the users that know your workflows, are a little bit technical, and want to use AI that can help you kind of really drive success from any AI initiative and like play with the tool. And then you can bring in more agents and scale. So like operational scale will come after the fact once you kind of play and iterate on that process.
Boy, I think that's another super important point because I see it as well, right? Where, and by the way, it comes back to content strategy and marketing strategy too, which is often the use case that we think we want to do first is not the use case we should do first. You know what I mean? And it's like, I wonder if you see that with the implementations that you're doing, where it's like, okay, they want to do this sexy, cool AI automation, agentic thing, and then they start getting into that use case and they go, oh, actually, we really can't do that until we solve this use case, right? So that's actually the better use case to start, like you were saying with your client. So do you find that you need to sort of back out and go, hey, let's talk about the unsexy one first, right? let's talk about the basic blocking and tackling here that could really move the needle, and not necessarily the super sexy personalizing the entire site, and doing that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. I think that's so true. It's like usually the unsexy use cases are the ones that are going to have you a lot of value before you can get to this like truly insane powered agentic workflow. Like there's nothing sexy about just searching through your content libraries, but it's a real thing. Like I've heard so many times from like marketers, like how much do we put into our campaigns? Like we perfectly crafted it, and then it's like a lost and forgotten after launch. Like we don't have time to work on it. We have endless content backlog. So like, can you even reuse it? Like how do you reuse the content you have? And even just starting from there is oftentimes we start with content. Is like, let's actually look at your content libraries. Where do you want to drive more mileage from? Like one campaign that we worked with one of our customers on was they actually had all this data that they spent months collecting research on all the multicultural segments. They did not create any emails for it because they didn't have time. So that was like their first use case of like, let's take all this data. We already have the insights, we have the surveys. Let's do a test of like different personalized messages and see what resonates. And honestly, from that test, they were able to see like a 93% like improvement in their click-through rates and like measuring their effectiveness. So there's a lot of mileage you can get from your own kind of libraries to start even. And there's a lot of fresh use cases you can do.
Take that to the bank, folks. It's not just the sexy stuff you got to do. You got to do the unsexy stuff too. Okay, but that brings up a great question. And it is this interesting, it's certainly something I've heard from perhaps those who are more AI reticent than others. which is this idea of the ethics, right? The ethics of AI decision making. And so tell me a little bit about what you're seeing out there in terms of either companies figuring it out, getting over it. What, where do we stand right now with, I'm really worried about the decisions, how AI is going to make decisions here and the ethics of all of that. What do you see when you look out on that?
And this one is like the number one question too. I feel like there's a lot of
Is it really?
top ones, but I think ethics is just always top of mind. And like, there's always this fear of like how we're going to use it. Cause if AI doesn't have guardrails, it can then it'll undermine it instead of strengthen it, but AI can really strengthen it and it should increase confidence, right? So I think about ethical AI, a lot of it is, one, do you have the people who are there to kind of build like these committees and how do you use it and build the guardrails and like train the system on what you think it should do? Because this is actually a combination of people and technology. Like the people have to sit in the room and actually think about, how do I want to use AI? How do I want it to represent my brand? How do I want it to show up in the content? And once you set that, then there's ways the system can train and use that to really create content. So one of like my favorite products that we worked on is actually came out of a whole co-innovation, one of our customers. They're like a large Fortune 500 CPG, and what they're doing and what they ask for is, there's this tension between always the global teams and the regional teams. Global teams want to make everything on brand, regional teams want to customize, and then they lose the brand. Right. And I remember I worked with one CMO who told me that like he actually had to cut the spending from regional teams to enforce brand compliance, and you can imagine that did not go well. Like that's not how we want to do it. So how do you give the regional teams power and then the global teams like control over the brand and how it shows up? And that also comes with like meeting legal rules and compliance rules. Like a big thing for them is they had really particular compliance requirements they had to follow in their content. So this is where like we built something called a brand agent, which is like an agent that can be your guardian to see like, is this following the guidelines that you set in the system? So I think that's one example where there's ways agents can help you enforce like brand governance and compliance. But in order to do that, like your people, your team has to get in a room and say, like, this is how we want the system to use AI.
Right. I mean, it's, as you and I have talked about before, it's one thing to be able to teach the software, the AI, the brand compliance, the legal compliance, the jargon, the sort of, customize it for the brand, et cetera, but maybe our first step is let's make sure the people understand it too, because in so many ways the people don't understand it before, and it becomes such a great way for us to make sure that we understand it. Because if we, as a mentor of mine once said, the best way to learn something is learn how to teach it. So if we're learning how to teach the AI, the brand, then we're learning too, right? Our teams are learning as well. I love that very much. So you get to an interesting segue here to our next topic here, which I think is really interesting, which is around that idea of brand compliance, the idea which is, okay, but we also want to sort of maintain this creative edge, right? This edge where we, sort of have either provocations, or we want to make some sort of, creative edge with our, and push the boundaries a little bit. What are some of the best practices that you're seeing there in terms of how do we start to maintain our creative edge as we're starting to give all these contexts to an agentic AI?
I think AI is all about maintaining your creative edge, because what's going to really distinguish any kind of creative or any type of marketer is their ideas. It's becoming more of an idea economy, right? Instead of being able to do the execution. So I actually think about it like, if I want to where's the best marketers or brands or agencies or illustrators we want to put on? You want to put them on like the Super Bowl campaigns or those big glossy brand campaigns, and that's where we all want to work on. Like those are the fun ones. Like nobody wants to be churning out 5 ad variations before lunch. I don't think that's something that we get up every day and is like, that excites me about my marketing. So it's like, there's a huge thing about performance and performance marketing and the need for it. But I actually think that's burning us out right now, because we just don't have the time or energy to do it. And it's not where we want to put our creative powers to, lack of better words. And so I think the brands that are going to win with AI and the marketers are going to win with AI is they're going to use AI to scale their what is unique about them. so that they can focus on those type of campaigns. So if you're going to use AI and you're just going to use ChatGPT to create prompts one by one, like I said, or like you never train it on your brand, like your voice, your tone, your guidelines, or like your voices by channel, it's going to sound like generic content. And then worse, it's going to sound like AI, which is just honestly dumb AI. So like, how do you kind of build like a brand partner with AI and make it so it's always repeatable and it's learning and evolving? How do you then use those AI first workflows that we talked about to build kind of those productivity gains? So then you can figure yourself up for like the fun big campaigns. So I think a lot of ways, like we're still the tastemakers as humans. Like AI really is like not about replacing humans, it's about amplifying humans. And at least the best marketers are going to use AI to like win with and give them a creative edge and use that to kind of free up their space. Because so many of us are just bogged down by like task and project management and like approval chasing versus actually working on the creative projects that we want to do. So we can take that piece out of it. I think there's a lot of room that we can have for honestly the more fun way of working.
I think that's, you know, I hadn't really even considered it that before, but I think that's such a practical and interesting way of looking at it, which is certainly it's not, you know, there's a Venn diagram here, there's an overlap for sure. But I think the way that you're suggesting that is sort of to think about, you know, sort of there's, you know, I mean, we talk about this all the time, this sort of balance of performance marketing versus brand marketing, and where brand marketing, we want to be super creative and push on, you know, push on the boundaries and making sure that we're doing super interesting, creative things. And performance marketing is literally about performance. And so it often isn't about pushing the creative edge in that way. And so it's assigning those roles and understanding those roles to be able to have our, you know, we often talk about, well, it'll give you the freedom to be more strategic and more creative. And it's like, but what does that really mean, right? What does that really mean? But this is a really practical way to think about it, is if it helps us to free up our time and creativity bandwidth, if you will, to focus on brand marketing, where performance marketing is something that we can basically, you know, help with this AI agent. That's a really practical way of thinking about it.
Yeah, one of the things that we did internally is actually like, I think it almost starts with the outcomes you want to deliver. So it's like, well, hey, our CEO had a certain outcome, or our CMO asked for a certain project. And then like one of them, we were a small team and we were like, okay, how do we get our SEO out the door? And actually, how do we do AEO? We used AI there to kind of help us build a strategy, like take our keywords, analyze it against like competitors, then create a workflow in terms of the content we like to create once we like iterated on it in terms of like, what's the voice, what's the tone, how does this like map kind of our outlines, how do we do it against each of our topics. Once we kind of, it took a little bit of iteration to get it right. Once we did that, now we kind of have a scale machine for it. So where my like content marketer can focus now is, okay, actually, instead of sitting here writing each of these blog posts one by one, or like restructuring them into like FAQs so they show up in AEO, how can I like, what is like, let me like look at our keyword strategy and analyze it against competitors. Let me look at like, what else is AEO ranking on? What is intent? What are people searching on these LLMs? Like, what are questions we should answer and make messaging? How do I partner with product marketing now to create more of that messaging? And then maybe that's something that we can offer a unique POV on, where you can actually build something for like an ad or a campaign. So it's less just like content churning, but actually being more like thoughtful on like, what is like the intent and what's the message? But you can't really do that when you're stuck in like the day-to-day grind. So I think that's really more like the creative and like the edge.
And well, and speaking of which, and this is the last topic that we'll cover before we get to some Q&A here, which is, okay, so in what are you seeing when we start thinking about, okay, we're thinking about performance, we're thinking about brand, and how that's helping us, you know, sort of create those experiences or manage those experiences in some way. What are some of the new metrics that you're starting to see for this AI-driven marketing that are starting to really, you know, show how or if we're moving the needle?
This one is really interesting because I think everyone is like, okay, talk about ROI too, right? Like, how do we show ROI from our
right, exactly.
How do we get success? There's two things I would say here. There's a topic of like, okay, how do I actually measure success from current projects? And from that, we always talk about like, there's like a maturity model for this. Like you have to build success with AI. So like, honestly, a lot of times like our teams start with like, can we increase content creation efficiency? Like, for instance, like, can we decrease the time we're spending on the asset? Can we cut costs somewhere in terms of how we're creating the assets? Like that's one piece. Once you build efficiencies and you build that workflow, can we scale that personalized content? Like how much scale are we doing? What did we do before? What are we doing now? Like it could easily be like, we didn't even build 3 versions of the campaign, now we can, or we got 500 asset variations that we can choose from in like one workflow. Then it's like the workflow and campaign effectiveness list. Can we figure out like where we made the workflow lift? How much manual work is done? How much did you integrate with the systems that you're already using and like creating more value from it? Like how much time did you free up? Did you increase effectiveness from your campaign? So there's a whole maturity model in terms of like how do you measure it. And then I think there's also like a future conversation around like what is the future world of metrics? And there's a lot of articles I've been reading on like the nature of the CMO, the role is changing. And like more and more the CMOs we talk to too is like, they're getting measured and they're getting asked to be more cross-functional and be more of a business player. Not just about like, can you show me like, what does brand actually mean? There's a lot of pressure to be like, well, how are you tying to both long-term value, which is what product does, and then short-term value, short-term sales, which the sales team is usually running. So they need to tie more and more their AI into business outcomes. And like our CEO even says, he says, there's a lot of metrics out there that are watermelon metrics. Like they look green on the outside because the dashboard says it, but inside it's red because you have no idea, like, did it actually impact your content? Did all those impressions impact like the improvement of customer loyalty and customer outcomes? And that's because that's what the CEO cares about. So with AI, I think you're going to have to like change on how we do metrics. It's going to be more about not these surface level metrics, but can we use AI then to tell us, is this content actually effective? Because we don't have that insight today, and AI can do that for us eventually. Is like, did this content actually resonate with this audience? And that will tell us like, okay, did it drive business outcomes we want to do?
I love, by the way, I'm totally stealing watermelon metrics. I absolutely, I think that's awesome. All right, let's get, let's get to some Q&A here. And the questions are coming in fast and furious. So thank you all for asking some questions. We'll have time to get to a couple. While I'm going through and picking one, I'm going to ask one of my own here, which is, so Arushi, out of the research we did together, like, what was the biggest thing that I think, what surprised you the most when we start to think of the research that we did on this Agents Together and all of that? What was the most surprising thing for you?
I think what always surprises me most, both from this research and in general, is it comes down to, I guess less a surprise, but it's more reaffirming, is like, it's not just the technology. I think it's really more the people process when it comes to it. So as we kind of think about how we're adopting this technology, where we're going, I think a lot of what's holding back AI implementations or like getting closer to AI in the future and unlocking agentic AI is often like mindset, or not having internal structures to drive change, or not having governance committees who've thought through like the ethics of AI, like all these different topics we're saying. There's a lot of people behind that need to drive that. So I think that piece that's always missing is like what's always a missing piece from actually realizing value from AI.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, it was, I have to say that the most surprising thing for me was really this, you know, how effective this idea of modularizing can be, right? You know, it's like, I myself have gotten wrapped around the axle of like, well, we have to get, you know, everything ready and, you know, getting everything cleaned and getting all this stuff. And as I started to see more and more of the real progress being made, where it's like, no, modularize, segment, start small, get going. I think that was one of the biggest surprises for me. So I was glad to see it. A great question came in from Susie, and I want to get your take on this, Arushi. So Susie says, I love this idea. And how do you think this might, and I'm assuming by this, Susie means the idea of agentic AI first workflows. How do you think this might affect people who are entering the workforce? Boy, have I had that conversation of late. People who might enter the workforce, who might have less experience and have traditionally been the quote unquote doers and haven't the strategic experience yet to be those in the creative director roles. How do you think all of this starts to affect entry level folks? I definitely have a take on this, but would love yours.
I want to hear yours, Robert. I mean, this is actually, oh wow, I have this conversation all the time just in my personal life. Like, I have so many little cousins are entering the workforce for the first time, like family members. We're talking about this with like kids and raising kids. It's just like, it is a whole different challenge. It's like, it's going to be so different from when we did our entry level jobs to where they are. So I do think that if you are later in your career, there's an advantage with AI because we know how to use AI to enhance our jobs. It's definitely scary for entering your workforce. I don't have a total answer on this one, but what I would think is the ones that are like, a lot of the, it also surprised me, someone like the kids in school that are using AI and they're showing me how they're using AI. It's crazy. It reminds me of like when the internet comes out, we showed our parents how we used the internet to like do research. Like,
Right.
I was talking about Professor Class, like nobody uses Dewey Decimal System anymore to do research or using the internet. And so it's, I think for those entering the workforce, ideally, or if those are already entering or trying to get a skill set, it's going to be like, how do you create skills that are going to position you in the future? So if you're taking a skill that's going to be really easily automated and train yourself on just like task-based work, that's probably going to take you to a disadvantage if you're not using AI actually in your everyday. Like I was talking about schools where some schools encourage AI, some schools don't. I'm actually of the mindset that should encourage AI because encourage them how to use it, encourage them how to be better workers with it because they're going to have an advantage if they do versus like scaring them away from it or saying they can't use it because they're going to be using it in the day-to-day world. So more encouraging them how to use AI because then they're creating their own workflows on how to do it and going to be more like thinking in that way because they're already training their brain to think with it and like prompt it, use agents, use workflows instead of they're training their brain to like, let me complete the task. So I think that's a little bit of like, I think it should be included early in a lot of our training in our programs because that's going to.
Boy, I wish it were. Yeah, I 100% agree. I mean, I think my very quick take on it is, and I rant on this a lot, which is, I think the answer for Susie, from my perspective, is I think it's an opportunity, not necessarily a foregone conclusion, because I think leaders in business are going to make stupid decisions, such as getting rid of, entry-level jobs and trying to replace. I think those that will advance, those that will actually evolve more fluidly with AI will be those who, look, if you believe that people using AI can, basically that AI can replace some of the jobs, some of the tasks that an entry-level person would do, you also have to believe in the corollary, which is that more people using AI will get you to better and deeper work. So you just have to believe both of those things if you believe any one of them. And so I think the opportunity is those entry-level positions, as long as you start thinking about how you are positioning yourself as more strategic from the beginning, right? You're not just a writer, you're a strategist. You're not just a designer, you're a strategist. And filling more of those seats on the bus, if you will, for being able to leverage AI as a tool, it's going to position you as more competitive. And the opportunity for businesses, whether they take it or not, is going to be that those entry-level positions start to become more strategic for all the reasons that we've been talking about for the last 45 minutes, right? And I think that's really it. All right, one more question before we get to the wrap up here, which is, this comes from Elena, and Elena asks, how do you recommend quality checking agentic AI outputs to make sure they reflect the original intent of your instructions? And she put "and" in all caps here. And what key checkpoints do you recommend throughout the agentic AI workflow to validate that it's progressing the right direction before delivering a final result? So basically, what safety checks are we putting in this sort of human in the loop idea? What are your thoughts there?
Oh, this is such a great question. And I think one, human in the loop is absolutely critical. This, like, you cannot let it, like, just agents and workflows just go without human in the loop. Actually, with every deployment we do and every customer experience we do, we have a process where a huge part is once the platform's set up, once you're like you've kind of defined your use cases, we've done scoping, it's all about how do we iterate, generate, iterate, calibrate, and making sure we're getting to the right outputs, and that lets you scale and operationalize. When you think of quality checks, there's a couple of things. Is like, one, even before you start setting up the agents, it's like, what is the kind of mapping the workflow and be like, okay, what are the points in the workflow that we do today? Because then you can identify, like, is there an agent for that, or can I create a custom agent for that? Like I was saying with that customer use case I was talking to. And then two, it's like, what is the context it needs? Like, is there data you need to integrate? Is there guidelines you need to integrate? Is there more additional context in terms of like, I want to target this instead of that? Like, what is that context? So that's almost like collecting like the inputs and the context Once you have the content, then it's like coming up with a rubric. And this is a little bit custom for each customer, because like you have a rubric in terms of what you're trying to go to. But in terms of quality, a lot of it in terms of like a lot of times we just define quality as like, is it good or bad? And that can be very subjective. So instead of just being like, is it good or bad? It's almost like, what was the goal you're trying to achieve? Did it one, understand your context very well and generate an output that mapped to it? Did it take a lot of the steps of the workflow that you wanted to do and actually automate it, so you're not doing it manually afterwards? How much was the time it took to get to it versus the time before? Because that starts building that ROI metrics. How many people did it take to do that before or after? That also builds the ROI metrics. And then in terms of quality, it's almost like, like part of that is then going to be, did it match my brand? Is it on voice? Is it on the right tone? Is it meeting the right audience? Did it understand that this audience cared about this? So therefore it's in the messaging across. Where is, did it take the formats? Did it do it within my layouts? Is it matching the layouts I provided? So it's within the templates. So many different things in terms of like what those like components of quality look like and what you define the agent should do. So from there, you can kind of then see like, okay, calibrate on those things, revise and tune the agents. And once you have a good workflow set up, you can operationalize it.
That's unbelievably clear and very practical. I love that. I love that answer. And it also speaks exactly to Susie's question earlier, right? You need people to do that. You need people for that. And, you know, the human in the loop idea, basically the human is the key part of that sentence. So it's a wonderful way for us to sort of conclude here. So Arushi, thank you so much for participating in this. It's been just absolutely wonderful.